morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program, where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. And we're going to be live today in 3 courtrooms across the country. We're coming up on the final arguments in a major trial that we've been covering all the way back since January. The state is finishing up their case in the trial of a former NFL star, and a defense team is continuing to argue that their client, a father accused of killing his 5 children, a brutal crime, they're claiming that he was in fact insane. So there's a lot to cover, and we're going to make sure that we'll cover it live. But first up, we want to switch gears. Summer's arrived. You're laying out in the sun, maybe you're on a porch, maybe you're taking a trip, and you're thinking, I know what you're thinking, I need a good summer read. Well, how about this? A true story about the trial of a former U.S. president who's sued by a powerful political opponent for allegedly lying about him. It's a case that took the nation by storm, and you can read all about it, how it all went down, in Theodore Roosevelt for the defense, the courtroom battle to save his legacy. It just made the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction in its first week, which is pretty amazing. Joining me to discuss it all and break it all down is the co-author of this book and the founder of our very own Law and Crime Network, Dan Abrams. Dan, great to see you here.
Jesse, good to be with you.
Great to have you. And, I got to start with this book. You and David Fisher write this book after writing Lincoln's Last Trial, which I read, which is great. And the first thing that I think about when I'm reading this book is timing. You got a president, had an interesting relationship with the media. He speaks out publicly against people that he's opposed to.
Yep.
I can't help but see similarities between him and President Trump. Is timing intentional with this book?
I think the timing was just sort of fortuitous that it ended up being so relevant to today. I mean, look, this trial is not new, right? It happened in 1915. The transcript, over 3,000 pages, has been sitting in Syracuse, New York, and no one is focused on it. There was one chapter in one Roosevelt book which mentioned this, but we were kind of amazed, like, why has this become a footnote to history? It's a fascinating case where Theodore Roosevelt is on the stand for 8 days. The former president of the United States, an iconic president. And the world at the time was watching. It was front page news everywhere. So, the fact that it happened to come out at a time when there are definitely similarities and differences, noted ones on both sides with regard to President Trump. So first of all, President Trump's being sued in civil court.
Right.
So he could end up being, testifying as a former president, just like Theodore Roosevelt was in his case. But yeah, I mean, look, Theodore Roosevelt was a guy who insulted his political opponents. He called Massachusetts and New York liberals shrill eunuchs. He regularly had a love-hate relationship with the media. He knew when to talk to them, but then would insult them publicly. In fact, used the Department of Justice to prosecute the media for articles that he didn't like.
Right.
And so there are definitely, one other thing is that he spoke out against judges. Mm-hmm. When the rulings came down, he would insult the judges the way that President Trump has done.
Yeah.
And the flip side of it is that there are also a lot of fundamental differences as well.
He has this interesting relationship with the media, but what really gets him into trouble, for lack of a better word, is he gathers these reporters at his home in Long Island. He speaks out against this Republican Party boss, this guy named Barnes. And I mean, there's one thing to criticize the political system. He goes after him and calls him corrupt. Yep. I mean, was this something that was new? I mean, was this something that was new to Roosevelt? Because he kind of has like an iconic image.
Yeah, he had called him corrupt before, I mean, in essence. And this time, Barnes decided to sue.
Right.
And look, you think about it in this day and age, right? The idea of like calling someone corrupt, it's nothing.
Right. Happens every day.
Right. But when Barnes when Roosevelt called Barnes corrupt, Barnes had his eye on a political future, and he wanted to take down Roosevelt. They'd had a big divide in 1912. So remember, in 1912. Theodore Roosevelt has now not been president for 4 years. He stepped down. He helped William Howard Taft get elected in 1908, 1909. And he's then not happy with Taft. So he then decides, I'm going to take the Republican Party back, and I want to be the candidate again. He believes that the only reason he didn't get the 1912 Republican nomination is because of people like Barnes, and in particular Barnes. the guy who ended up suing him. And as it turns out, in 1912, Roosevelt got more votes than Taft, but they split the vote and Woodrow Wilson gets elected. So 1914 now, 2 years later, he's talking about how Barnes and the head of the Democratic Party are basically in cahoots with each other. And he's saying that they're trying to keep power so that citizens can't vote directly for senators. And that is horrible. And the reason that's happening is because these guys are in this corrupt alliance. That's the statement he makes. There's a history there. And then when we get to the courtroom, it is amazing. And by the way, the end of the trial,
Right.
the verdict, which I'm not going to give away. You can look it up online. But
read the book.
It's 100 and something years old, so it's not just happening. It's not like here on court and when we cover courtrooms live around the country.
Right.
So it's a verdict where you think there's a verdict, and then there's an issue.
Well, that's not the only thing that I think people will be looking for, because he takes the stand, doesn't he?
For 8 days.
What is that like, him on the stand? I mean, this is a guy who just didn't back down from anybody.
No.
So what was he like on the stand?
He was Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, and that's one of the great things about this book, is that typically when we look back at historical leaders, we see speeches they've made, things that they've written. This is unvarnished. This is Theodore Roosevelt being attacked by a lawyer who doesn't like him personally or politically and wants to embarrass and shame him.
Right.
And so, but they're not just talking about like random issues. They're talking about fundamental issues related to his legacy.
Yeah.
So this cross-examination becomes fascinating.
And he welcomed it. When he gets sued, I'll give everything. I'll give all my materials.
He was saying he welcomed it, but behind the scenes, this weighed on him, this trial. And one of the things that's been amazing to me is in the fact this became kind of a footnote to history, is that this trial mattered enormously to Roosevelt. Roosevelt cared a lot about this case. And in fact, he updated his bio once this case was over to refer to the case. So it was an important case to him because he cared enormously about his honesty and his integrity. And when you talk about honesty, there's a difference right there from Donald Trump. Meaning that even Trump supporters would say, well, so he sort of shades the truth a little bit sometimes.
Right.
But Roosevelt would never do that. Roosevelt viewed honesty and integrity and probity as all very
He had to, though, because if you look back at the law, and this day, when you sue somebody for libel, it's very different than it was today. Didn't he have to go forward and actually say what he was saying was true? And
Yes.
It's much different than it was today.
So today, if you sue a public figure, you have to be able to show that the person basically had serious questions about the truth of it. It's called reckless disregard for the truth. But that, in essence, they kind of knew or should have known that what they were saying wasn't true. Then you didn't have to show that. Then the minute you showed that a statement was effectively defamatory, calling someone corrupt is defamatory, burden shifts right away. Now you, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt, former President of the United States, you now have to prove that what you said was true. And that's what happened in this case, where Roosevelt then had to take on that burden.
And again, for a person who wanted to always speak the truth, it helped him in a way that
and this was a precursor. I mean, talking about the Law&Crime Network,
right.
I mean, this was kind of a precursor to what we're seeing today, which is the courtroom was packed with people coming every day to watch the trial. And that's kind of what we do here at Law&Crime, is allow the people who can't make it into the courtroom every day to be able to see what's happening. And the fact that, as you pointed out at the top, that we're in 3 different trials around the country right now, 3 big, interesting, important cases, just shows you how many fascinating cases. And this, at the time, was definitely one of the, it was the trial of the century, at least in 1915. There have been probably 20 trials that century.
Well, look, and the thing that was different about this trial as opposed to Lincoln's last trial, which you covered, and which is similar, you had more information.
Yeah.
And you talk about the trials we cover here. We have so much information to cover these trials. But when I'm reading this book, it's a nonfiction book, but it feels like a thriller because the details are there.
Think about a 3,000-plus page transcript of everything that happened.
Right.
So we have every word. In the Lincoln case, we only had the witnesses, and it had been handwritten, et cetera. And here we've got everything from the pretrial hearings, opening statements, judges' rulings. Lincoln, we had much more limited information. Here we've got everything related to this case. And I think that does allow us to present an even richer narrative on what happened in this case than in the Lincoln case. I mean, look, the Lincoln trial is fascinating because it was the only case where there's any transcript of one where Lincoln was the lawyer. But here you have Theodore Roosevelt as the defendant with everything in his mind to lose here. And as I say, it mattered enormously.
You know what's great when I speak to you, Dan? The love of history that you have.
Yeah.
Why do you have this love of history? I mean, we see it so much in these kinds of
look, I think history teaches us lessons, when there are questions. I'll give you an example. When Theodore Roosevelt didn't know what to do, he was faced with tough situations, what would he do? He would ask himself, what would Lincoln do? And he would go back and he would look back to Lincoln to look for answers. And I think the same thing applies today, which is, when we are covering trials here on Law and Crime Network, part of what we need to do and part of what makes you so good at what you're doing is you're able to say, oh, you know what? There are other cases, and you can refer back to other trials that we've covered. This reminds me of when we did this case. And that's really helpful, I think, for people because, that's 1 year, 2 year, 3 years history. But history, looking back at previous cases, precedent, as we refer to it, is really helpful, I think, in teaching us all, providing answers to questions we may not know.
Look, a lot of people have an idea about what the court system's like, a lot of idea about what trials are like, and they see it, and it's much different than the way it's portrayed in media, but they also get a sense of a pattern of it. And as we cover these trials, there are these similarities. I guess my next question is, what's the next book? What other president are you going to be writing about?
We have another book that we have not announced yet. If I was going to announce it anywhere, it would certainly be here. But we can't disclose yet what it is, but it is another transcript.
Okay.
Another sort of forgotten, high-profile case from history that I think people will be very interested in.
Well, I'm excited to finish this book. I want everybody to pick it up and read it, and then we'll talk about book number 2.
Exactly.
Dan,
Jesse Weber,
so much. Appreciate
thank you.
It.
Let's get back to covering some trials.
I know, we have a lot of trials to cover. 3 big trials, as Dan said. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, a lot more to cover. Be back.